What is it about photography that attracts you? Is it the ability to freeze a moment in time forever, to capture the world through your eyes, to portray your vision in art? Or is it camera gear? Most videos on YouTube are not actually about taking photographs. They're about camera gear, and they are about magnifying things to ridiculous proportions to tell you why this is better than this and you need to upgrade from this to that. It's absolutely ridiculous. Cameras have literally become just as disposable as children's toys. In fact, I think Sony release a new camera every few weeks, don't they? It's just ridiculous. Time was that cameras were around for years. This is the Nikon F3. It was a professional camera released, I think, 1981. I got mine through the 80s and I still have it and I love it very much. And this was around till 2000, 2001. There were professional photographers who started in the 80s with perhaps a couple of battered F2s. They then bought one or two F3s and a few lenses. Obviously, at that time, they would also have a medium format setup for more demanding work, perhaps a Mamiya RB67 and maybe even a 4x5 camera for super high quality images. But in terms of 35mm, there are photographers that could have been using the same camera for well over a decade. Not really any need to upgrade. It was about art. It was about photography. It wasn't about the gear. But now it is more pixels and more pixels and more pixel peeping and scrutiny, and it is absolutely ridiculous. And I often see how ridiculous it is when I actually stop looking forward and start looking backwards. I do have, a couple of the latest cameras, the latest Fujis. I've got Nikon D850, and I still have a few of my older Nikons. Now, this, for example, the D700 was the pro camera of about a decade ago. It's 12 megapixels. Many professionals still use this camera today. It's absolutely fantastic, especially for event documentary, that sort of thing. Yes, many wedding photographers use this camera. Personally, I wouldn't have risked a wedding with this camera because it only takes one memory card. And for me, that would be far too much of a risk. That was one thing I didn't like about film. I've never been a professional photographer, but I have photographed weddings in the past. And I can tell you that I was sitting on hot charcoal from the minute I sent off those films to the minute I got them back processed and printed, because you never know what may go wrong. So I find it strange that Nikon only fitted that camera out to take one memory card, because the D300S, which was of the same era, basically it was the baby brother of that one, had two memory cards. So not really sure. But what really can drive it home, and I would urge you to take this challenge, because I will go on an old camera shoot and make a video with a few different cameras in the near future. For example, this was my first DSLR, the Nikon D70S. You can still get immaculate ones for well under £100. And because a lot of these were an amateur camera, they weren't really used professionally. So there are many of these around that have a very low shutter count, and it has everything that you need for all but the most demanding of photographers. It's only 6 megapixels, and you would think to yourself, oh my God, 6 megapixels, that's rubbish. Well, actually, in around 2006, 2008, when photographers were switching over, especially wedding photographers, to digital, they only had around 6 or 8 megapixels to work with, and they could get stunning images with those 6 or 8 megapixels. But ironically, some of the latest advances, especially in Adobe Photoshop, could have given these cameras a new lease of life, because even if you do like higher resolution images, the ability to upscale now with the AI technology in Photoshop is absolutely incredible. Yes, of course, you can't create detail out of thin air. So no, you can't upscale a photograph of a newspaper to a billboard size and have crisp resolution. But how often is that the case? You need to bear in mind that some of the greatest photographers in the world, Margaret Bourke-White, Ansel Adams, Henri Bresson, had cameras that were nowhere near as good as what is available to us today. And some of the most iconic images in history, like Lung Chatop, the Empire State Building with the builders sat on a RSJ beam, or the famous Times Square kiss with the sailor at the end of World War II. Look at those images closely. It's not about resolution, it's about the image, it's about the art, it's about the moment. And I do feel that we are swept away with this rhetoric for YouTube, and most of these people, they're not offering reviews. They're literally selling camera gear in disguise, and they make a living out of making you feel that your gear is not good enough when it is. You don't need to spend a fortune. Photography has never been as accessible as it is today. There's a whole wealth of Nikon lenses that are available that can be used on all of these Nikon cameras, as well as all of the mirrorless cameras. And now that Nikon has finally changed mounts from the Nikon F mount to the Nikon Z mount, a lot of the demanding photographers, although they can use a converter, will, as time goes by, prefer to use native lenses. I do that with my Fujis, although I can experiment with a few lenses with a converter. I prefer to stick to native lenses, because otherwise when you add a 1.5 inch converter to a full frame lens on a small Fuji, it defeats the object of having bought a crop centered mirrorless camera. I wanted the Fuji because I wanted good quality images. I love their film effect and their colors, of course, but certainly for travel or walkabout, I wanted something that was a bit more discreet than this, because when you point this in people's faces, they react, and sometimes they react badly. I have had quite a few bad reactions from people who weren't actually my target in the photograph. They just thought they were. You don't quite get that with a small Fuji camera, because most people just think that you're just an amateur, which is how it's better to be, especially for street photography. With regards to lenses, some of the latest Samyang lenses are absolutely amazing. They make some wide lenses that are so sharp, they beat just about everything. In fact, Samyang has recently released a full frame 10mm f3.5 lens, the widest lens in production, and it has edge to edge sharpness. Even Zeiss couldn't beat that lens at that focal length for sharpness, wide open. And that brings us to another point. So many of these fast lenses perform badly wide open. Now, on manual focus, I do prefer the wider aperture lenses, not for capturing images, but simply because it makes it easier to focus manually, especially if you're using film cameras, which I do sometimes use my my f3, and obviously there isn't focus peaking or anything like that. So having a 1.4 lens on there means that when I'm focusing, the lens is wide open at 1.4 and it snaps into focus. But even that Nikkor 50 f1.4 wide open, I'm not very impressed with it. The Samyang lenses are better, they're sharper, to be honest. And you don't need to pay a great deal of money for them. So buy the gear that suits what you want to do. And also, as I've said in a previous video, have a lens buying strategy. There's no point buying a 12mm or 14 if you're full frame and the ultra wide, and then getting a 20, and then getting a 35 and a 50 and an 85, because the difference between a 35 and a 50 is, there's a difference, but it's not drastic. The same goes between a 24 and a 35. There's a difference, but it's not drastic. I always advise people to think of buying lens in focal lengths that double. So you could go for 35, 85, 135 with an ultra wide, either fixed or zoom, or you could go for 24, 50, 105, once again with an ultra wide if you should need it. There isn't really any need to have all those in between lenses, because in my experience, all that does is it makes life difficult, because you're out and about and you're spending more time deciding which lens you're going to use rather than capturing images. And also, as a challenge, I tend to like ultra wide shooting, because as I see it, photographing buildings, landscapes, etc., everything's been photographed. So I'd like to photograph things with a different perspective, an ultra wide, almost distorted perspective, perhaps in an infrared color processing, albeit done digitally, just something that's different. But then as a challenge, one of these days I will go out with a 50 or even an 85 photographing landscapes, so that I can get different perspectives to what I normally get, so that I have some sort of challenge. Point is, or the moral is, you don't need the latest gear. You don't need to be chopping and changing your camera left, right and center. And if you're thinking of going professional today, depending what you're going to do, if you're going to become a portrait photographer and wedding photographer, you could quite easily start off with a couple of D700s, or you could even go for a couple of the early D800s, which are amazing cameras. If you could stretch to it, you don't need to go out and get the latest D850 or Z7 and the latest Z lenses, which are £2,000 a pop, to actually produce good work. You are able to produce the good work with anything. And a prime example is this one, which is my glove box camera. I have 2 or 3 of these. This is the Nikon V1, was introduced about a decade ago as a compact professional system. It was horrendously expensive, which was its downfall, or pushing about £1,000. But it was a mirrorless camera. Focusing, even by today's standards, is very quick. Lenses are silent. It can shoot full HD up to 60 frames per second, and it can shoot RAW. It's only 10 megapixels. They did make a V2 that was more, and a V3 that was 14 or 16 or something like that, whatever it was. But I'm quite happy with this, and I've had some amazing images taken with this. Remember, the moral is, the best camera is the camera that you have with you. And if you just go for what you think you need, and you end up walking around with a tank with a big lens on it, which means that after a while you stop walking around with it because it's hard work, that means you'll miss images because you don't actually have your camera with you. So how about going for a small camera with a 50 on it, or a 35, or a wide lens, whatever the case may be, that you could actually use all the time. And if you haven't paid a fortune for it, you don't mind walking around with it. If I'm traveling and I'm going walkabout with my camera in the evening or at night, even in foreign places, do I really want to be walking around with £2,000 or £3,000 in my hand? Or would I prefer to be walking around with a camera that costs a couple of £100 and a lens that costs £150, £200 as well? Not that that's not an insignificant amount of money, but it's a far smaller loss than £3,000 or £4,000 or £5,000 if the worst should happen. Just a few thoughts. If you have any comments, please feel free to express your opinion, agree, disagree. That's fine by me, and I'll see you in the next video.